Imagine walking into your boss's office to ask for a raise and he says, "Son, we can't give you a raise because China is richer than us." You would probably laugh at him, right? Because we know that America, not China, is the richest country in the world, or at least it used to be. So who really has more money, the US or China? This question seems easy to answer, but the answer might surprise you. At first glance, the United States is clearly richer than China. According to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the U.S. nominal GDP reached $28.78 trillion in 2024, while China's was only $18.53 trillion. In other words, the U.S. economy is almost 60% larger than China's. However, if we use purchasing power parity, PPP, which adjusts for differences in consumer prices between countries, the picture changes dramatically. China's GDP becomes $33 trillion, about $10 trillion more than the US, meaning China would be the clear winner. So is China richer than the USAG? Well, maybe, maybe not. It all depends on how you look at it. If we look at GDP per capita, the measure of the average economic output per person, the US is still much richer than China. According to the World Bank, in 2024, the U.S. GDP per capita was $86,600, while China's was only $13,145, less than one-fifth of the U.S. amount. This means that each person in the U.S. economy produces nearly 6 times more than each person in China. That is a huge difference. So even though China is a massive country with more than 5 times the population of the U.S., the combined economic power of all Chinese people is still much smaller than the combined economic power of all Americans. On this basis, there is no doubt that the U.S. is much richer than China. But what if we consider the wealth of both countries rather than their annual incomes? In this case, the results are surprising. According to Credit Suisse, the total wealth of all Americans in 2022 was around $91 trillion, while the total wealth of all Chinese was over $121 trillion. This means that Chinese people collectively have more than 33 more wealth than Americans. How can this be possible? After all, the US is the world's most developed country, and China is still considered a developing country. Moreover, the US has only around 5% of the world's population, while China has 18%. So wouldn't it make sense for Americans to have more wealth than Chinese? Not necessarily. Here's why. The wealth of a nation depends on many factors such as natural resources, technology, infrastructure, human capital, institutions, and policies. And these factors don't always add up in the same way. For example, China has abundant natural resources, especially energy resources like coal, oil, and gas, which power its fast-growing economy. In fact, China has the largest proven reserves of coal in the world and is the second largest producer and consumer of oil after the U.S. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, in 2021, China produced 112 billion barrels of crude oil, while the U.S. produced 18 million barrels. However, China consumed 14 million barrels of crude oil, while the U.S. consumed only 18 million barrels. This means that China's net oil production was 74 billion barrels, while the U.S. net oil production was negative 7 million barrels. China also has plenty of other valuable resources like iron ore, copper, lead, zinc, aluminum, gold, and rare earth elements, which are crucial for advanced technologies such as semiconductors, electric vehicles, solar panels, and wind turbines. In fact, China has more than 50% of the world's known reserves of rare earth elements and accounts for 70% of the world's production of them. These resources give China a huge advantage over the U.S. in terms of wealth. Another factor that makes China richer than the U.S. is land. China ranks 12th in the world in terms of total area with 9.6 million square kilometers, while the U.S. ranks 4th with 9.8 million square kilometers. But China has more usable and productive land than the U.S. First, China has much more arable land, which is essential for feeding its large population. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, China has 121 million hectares of arable land, while the U.S. has only 37 million hectares. This means that China has 3 times more farmland than the U.S. Despite having a smaller area, China also has more forest land, which provides timber, paper, oxygen, and carbon storage. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, China has 530 million hectares of forest land, while the US has 390 million hectares. This means that China has 34 more forest land than the US. Finally, China has more freshwater resources than the US, according to the World Resources Institute. China has 2,700 cubic kilometers of renewable freshwater resources, while the US has only 900 cubic kilometers. This means that China has 3 times more water than the US. All of these factors give China a significant advantage over the US in terms of wealth. In addition to natural resources, China also has a massive workforce and domestic market. China has the largest population in the world, with 1.4 billion people and a growing middle class with more than 600 million people. This gives Chinese companies a huge market to sell their products and services, as well as a large pool of workers to hire from. Moreover, China has been investing heavily in education, science, technology, and innovation, which have boosted its productivity and competitiveness. China now has many world-class universities, research centers, and high-tech industries. According to the World Bank, China ranks first in the world in terms of scientific publications, patent applications, and high-speed internet users. China also has a well-developed transportation infrastructure, including the world's fastest train and the world's largest high-speed rail network. So when we look at all these factors, it's clear that China is a much wealthier country than the US, and it will become even wealthier in the future. However, this does not mean that China is a better or happier country than the US. In fact, China faces many internal challenges that could affect its future wealth. One of the biggest challenges is its aging population. China's working-age population has been shrinking in recent years due to factors such as the one-child policy, urbanization, and rising incomes. This means that China will have fewer workers to support its economy and more retirees to care for. Another challenge is China's wealth gap. Although China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the past decades, it still has a large and growing income inequality. According to the World Bank, the richest 10% of Chinese people earn more than 40% of the country's total income, while the poorest 20% earn less than 10% of the total income. This disparity could lead to social unrest and instability, which could hinder China's development. These challenges show that wealth is not just about numbers or rankings, it's also about how we measure and perceive it. Different measures and perspectives can lead to different conclusions and insights. There is no single or correct way to measure or compare wealth across countries or individuals. Each measure has its own strengths and limitations and reflects different aspects of wealth. For example, GDP measures the monetary value of goods and services produced in an economy, but doesn't consider non-monetary aspects such as health, education, or environment. GNI, on the other hand, includes income from abroad, but doesn't account for income distribution or non-material aspects. Human Development Index (HDI) considers health, education, and income, but doesn't capture all dimensions of well-being or subjective measures of happiness or satisfaction. Ultimately, wealth is a complex and multidimensional concept that goes beyond economic indicators. It encompasses various aspects of well-being and prosperity, such as health, education, environment, and social equity. Different measures and perspectives can provide valuable insights into different aspects of wealth and well-being. So rather than focusing on a single measure or ranking, it's important to consider multiple perspectives and use a combination of quantitative and qualitative measures to get a more complete picture of wealth and well-being.
Well, folks, that's it for today's video. What do you think about the topic? Which country is richer, China or the US? Let me know in the comments section below. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss any of our awesome videos. See you next time.